Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Dr. Tharoor, thank you so much for taking the time. And I know you have such a busy schedule and, all that's going on in your political life and your writing life. And thank you for taking the time to talk to me about my book. I'm deeply touched and honored. Thank you so much.
Thank you for writing it, Moin. I must say, I had, of course, read your first book on Surat, and particularly given my interest in the colonial relationship, your forefather's quest to reclaim his inheritance, going off to England and fighting for his rights, all of that was fascinating. But this is a very different book. And I must say, starting off with the magnificent title, The Lost Fragrance of Infinity, you have actually gone farther back into your own roots, I think, because I understand you're a descendant of Hazrat Modud Chishti, one of the founders of the Chishti Sufi order. And presumably that and your own grandfather's scholarship in Sufism must have influenced you as a young person. And you decided to write a book that would be both a novel and an extraordinary introduction to Sufism. Fascinating. Tell me how you got into this journey, what inspired you to start, and how you found this particular way of telling of communicating what you wish to tell the reader.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. Yes, but I must admit, I didn't write the book, thinking deeply about my forefathers and their Sufi connection. But yes, I am descended from Hazrat Modud Chishti, who was one of the stalwart founders of the Chishti order. But there were many reasons for writing this book. One of the main reasons was, today Sufism is thought of as visiting a dargah, having a wish granted, listening to some lovely qawwali, and which is fabulous. And I still do that. It really is. Many wishes have been granted at the shrine of the great Sufi. So yes, I do that. But the philosophical thought behind Sufism and the contributions of the Sufis to mathematics, to science, to spirituality, and to art, in many ways is a lost voice. The way they understood Plato, Aristotle, the concept of the oneness of God in the Upanishads, and then related that to the Quran in a philosophical manner, and were able to look at the Quran in terms of a philosophy rather than a rule book that needed to be imposed on everyone, was something that was the heartbeat of the way Sufism flourished. And so that was the main reason why I got deeper and deeper involved in researching Sufi philosophy, Sufi accomplishments in mathematics and art. And I decided to make it a novel because I very quickly realized, and I know that academics are the backbone of literature, but I did very quickly realize that if I needed to get the work across to a wider audience, a younger audience, and even an audience which is a little older, but I realized that it would be confined probably only to the archives, where one would refer to it for their thesis or something like that. I wanted this to be a human story, and most importantly, the story of vulnerability and how one is able to build or rebuild his life through the philosophies of generosity, kindness, oneness of the Sufis. And that's why
I think it's worked. I think, in fact, it's a triumph that you've chosen this route, because you're quite right. If you had written a book, Introduction to Sufism in the classic sense, I might have dipped into it. I might have put it aside and said, I'll get to it when I next need to know about Sufism. You know how it is. Whereas a novel is something anyone can read at any time. And the story is fascinating. Your protagonist is a craftsman, not a philosopher. He's a tile maker. And that's also very interesting, that you've chosen somebody who works with his hands to tell a story about the mind and the soul, which I thought was very interesting. As somebody who is fascinated by history, I really enjoyed the period in which you set it, the collapse, in a sense, of three empires, starting off with the Mughal Empire in India, where he is born and raised, and where he suffers horrors at the hands of Nadir Shah and his troops, and then has to flee. And in his flight, his journey is also, I take it, a metaphor for the journey through which the human soul searches for unity with the divine and for love of the divine. That romantic and spiritual journey that your protagonist, Karar Ali, undertakes is sort of, in some ways, paralleled by the idea of the Sufi quest for love. Ultimately, the unity of being. You have an outward journey, the physical journey of the man from Delhi through Central Asia, Europe, etc., and you have the inward journey, in which the protagonist is essentially trying to endure an experience of love and loss. And when he gets to the olive groves of Andalusia towards the end, the love that he has lost at the beginning or early part of the novel, and then that essentially destroys much of his own self-love and his ego and so on, leads through the realization in his journey that he's bettering his life through his own deeds of kindness and preparing his soul for this ultimate unity with the divine spirit. I hope I've got it right. I don't mean to sound heavy, but you do it beautifully, and you do it actually with a deftness and lightness of touch, which I think I don't want to let people feel this. They have to have taken courses in philosophy to appreciate this. There is symbolism, but there's also a great story. So very well done. I think you really have pulled it off, Moin. Tell us more about this and reacting to what I've said.
Thank you. You've captured it probably way more eloquently than anyone else. So, and I'm not surprised. So, the articulation in which you have expressed the beauty of Sufism, Dr. Tharoor, is something which is stunning. The role of the protagonist in the book is one which I went through about 4 or 5 drafts with my agent here in England, because we were just, to reach a place where you can start writing and building a character who is human, sensitive, vulnerable, a knowledge seeker. One has to build a character that is, has a sponge-like soul and a sponge-like mind, and then relate that to the philosophies of the Sufis. So, in many ways, the character's journey, as you rightly said, is a metaphor for a human being's journey. The journey of seeking a perfect life is probably, not the right way to look at life, because perfection is fragile and perfection can come to an end very quickly. And his relatively perfect life, where he's endowed with great skills and bestowed with great, rewards by the emperor, and he's found his lady love as well, is destroyed, although he's living a perfect life. And then the rebuilding of that life with an inward journey to understand what it means to understand your space as a human being in the life that you're given and your relationship with the greater creator. So you are a microcosm, and you're yet there's a word that the Sufis use very often called Ashraful Makhlukat, which basically is you are the greatest creation, but you're also a microcosm. And how do you see yourself in relation to this philosophy? And it's through this journey that he re-explores himself. But the one thing that I'd like to touch upon a little briefly is the beauty of the craft that he is immersed in. And that is the craft of tile making, particularly geometric tile making. And during my research, there's been enormous amounts written on how the Sufis perceive geometry. They held Brahmagupta, who was the Indian Hindu mathematician in great and high regard. Al-Khwarizmi says he could not write until he had studied Brahmagupta. Anyways, the Sufis then take this understanding of geometry and refine it even further, come up with things like cubic equations, and then fling themselves into craftsmanship. But if you were to read about geometric tile making, which my protagonist is a master of, it can be, once again, quite academic. But when I was in Bursa, which is not far from, which is about 2.5 hours drive from Istanbul, I met a Sufi sitting outside the Yesel Kami Mosque. And he said, and I'm cutting all of this very short, he said, look at this. This is a star. Here's a pentagon. Here's a square. Here's a hexagon. Here's an octagon. What does that tell you? These are the different shapes of human races, of mankind, all coming together and interlocking in their search of enlightenment, which is the star. And that's the beauty of Sufism, bringing people together. And that's how, the book kind of got a bit of traction.
Well, it was interesting that in your introduction, when you say that the philosophy of self-examination, compassion, and immersion in divine love made the Sufi curious, scientifically innovative, and spiritually magnetic. And that is, of course, a larger philosophical, spiritual aspiration. And then later we see in the novel the link to what you've just described, the geometry of tile making. And you have in the novel a character called Shah Razan, who talks about the tiles, the diverse tiles, as diversity interlocked in beauty. And then this Shah Razan looks at the sky and says, he, namely God, of course, is the whole, and within him is the harmony of diversity. When you create these different shaped tiles, seek to become part of this harmonious whole, the geometric tile panel will reflect your quest for union with him. So it's fascinating the way in which the craftsmanship and the philosophy come together. And I was very struck. I remember, amongst the many rave reviews you've got is one by the highly respected historian and archivist Rana Safwi, who says that in these different shapes of tiles, the square shape reflects the Holy Kaaba, the octagonal shape was inspired by the divine throne, that is Arsh, which is supported by 8 angels, therefore octagonal. The dome was a reminder of the vault of heaven, and so on. And this is striking because obviously when you walk into a mosque or a religious place, maybe you can think along those lines. But this kind of beauty of tile work is everywhere, even in purely quote unquote secular buildings. And what's very interesting about that is the extent to which even, if you like, the craft of tile making is linked to a larger understanding of the world and of divinity.
That's right. And as I said, Dr. Tharoor, there have been, innumerable books written on this art form. There are masses of books in the libraries in Istanbul. There are masses of books in Granada. There are books in Isfahan, in Delhi. You find all of this very specifically written out in terms of what shape represents which. But I go back to this meeting that I had with this Sufi sitting in Bursa, literally just twirling his prayer beads, sitting with the craftsman. And the beauty with which the simple craftsman in a relatively obscure part of Bursa explained this beauty, and you could see it radiating in their eyes, the beauty of mankind and what it can accomplish if it comes together. And it brought me very quickly to, not too long ago, America put the Ingenuity on Mars. And when the celebrations happened, you could see the one person who was directing the landing of that spaceship on Mars was an Indian. Some of the engineers were Chinese. You had an extraordinary amount of Americans who worked on it. The technology of the electric wiring came from France, and that's the beauty of mankind. When mankind comes together, this is the kind of accomplishments that it can achieve. And so I decided very quickly that once I had found that ribbon of geometric tile work all the way from Andalusia, then into Istanbul and into Isfahan, and then into Delhi and Samarkand in Uzbekistan as well, I realized that I had the story in terms of at least, who would be the protagonist and what would be his quest in this world that he was seeking. But if I may, Dr. Tharoor, if you can just give me a couple of seconds, I'd like to talk about the concept of ishq,
Yes.
which becomes a part of this quest. Ishq, which means love in Urdu and in now in Hindi, in Farsi and Arabic as well, actually has 308 layered meanings, which is so difficult to understand. And the truth was that Rumi was in love with Tabriz, and without Tabriz, he could not find God. The fact also is that the greatest Sufi philosopher, Ibn Arabi, who was born in Andalusia but now lies buried in Damascus, was madly in love with a woman called Nizam. The greatest poet that emerged from Persia, Hafiz, was madly in love with a woman called Shakinabat. And not going far, even Dante and Beatrice. So this ability to find the divine's attributes in and his beauty manifesting itself in a woman was something that captured my imagination. And while the likes of Ibn Arabi and Rumi and Hafiz are great philosophers, they were men who had fallen in love with ladies, and how is that not been represented in many books that have been written on Sufism is something that I thought I needed to address through the story of this young man who loses love and then finds love again, by understanding the concept that the attributes of the divine are even there in the one person that he loves.
Wonderful. No, I think that you've summarized that and captured it beautifully. I do want to briefly move aside from the larger ideas in the book to some of the story, because I think that we mustn't let listeners forget this is still a novel, and a novel with some very interesting developments in it, events in it, and storylines in it. So you've got a rather interesting depiction of early 18th century Delhi, an empire clearly on the decline, with Muhammad Shah Rangila ruling, this wonderful, creative, artistic, rather gifted man who obviously was hopeless at the tough stuff of governing, particularly armies and so on. You managed to have your hero, Karar Ali, fall in love with a girl who's the daughter of a general who sardonically remarks that our emperor would much rather convert his garrisons into art galleries. And I'm sure there were generals who felt exactly that in real life at that time. But anyway, so there's that. And then you've got the attack, the invasion by Nadir Shah. You've got horror and devastation that follows. You have a romance, a very beautiful romance between Karar Ali and Abira, the daughter of the general Shahbaz Khan. You've got a rather dramatic event in which riots are breaking out in the city. And during one of these, Karar Ali, don't want to have a spoiler, but he kills the right hand of Nadir Shah. And that's what sets Nadir Shah's troops after him, and that's why he has to flee. But of course, there's also other tragedies I don't want to spoil for the readers that oblige him to flee, and that puts him through all the journeys that take him as far as I've already mentioned he goes. So you've got that fascinating storyline. There's a theme, I think, in that early portion of the inclusive and synodistic nature of Delhi, which I think is fascinating. It's a city that, even in those days, was welcoming a confluence of communities. I don't think people realize how many Uzbeks there were in Delhi. And of course, Karar Ali flees with a bunch of Uzbeks, but there you are, people from the Ottoman Empire coming in large numbers, people obviously from Persia, people from other parts of India and of the Mughal Empire. So it really was an amazingly cosmopolitan place, even while you depicted very much in decline. The other thing, of course, is the extraordinary culture, the poetry. There's a Sufi poet from Isfahan who becomes a mentor to Karar Ali and introduces him not only to Sufi works, but also to concepts of geometry and algebra. You've got all of these things happening, and I think maybe as a writer, you should take a couple of minutes to tell readers about these storylines and story elements in the book. I've carefully confined myself only to the first portion of the book so as not to spoil some of the later developments for the reader. But these are things that I think should not be lost sight of while we rightly celebrate the philosophical content, the Sufi learnings in the book, it's still a damn good story.
Well, thank you, Dr. Tharoor. It is a story that I needed to embed at a point in time when it's reflective of the twilight of three empires. The Ottomans, now that has taken over after the Safavids have collapsed. And of course, as you rightly mentioned, the Mughals are in twilight and in very, very swift decline. It's in these times that Delhi is still a heartbeat of cosmopolitan living. As you rightly said, it's bursting with color, with poets, with people who are creatively inclined and encouraged by a deeply creatively motivated emperor called Muhammad Shah. And it is through this time when the word has gone around all the way from Istanbul to Delhi that anarchy is going to be unleashed, because the Ottomans have lost a lot of their lands in Eastern Europe. The Mughal Empire is shrinking. Nadir is raping and pillaging his way around, and yet, amidst all of this, there is beauty. Amidst all of this, there is this quest to explore, to break new frontiers. The finest poets are emerging on the steps of the Jama Masjid in Delhi. Mir Taqi Mir, arguably even greater than Mirza Ghalib, according to some great scholars. We have
Ghalib was 100 years later.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And Dard, who wrote poems steeped in mysticism, Sauda, who also wrote the same. But all of them, dare I say this for lack of better expression, free-minded spirits, scathing of the one-dimensional Islamic clergy, openly castigating them on the steps of the Jama Masjid. Mir Taqi Mir writes about his passionate love for women on the steps of the mosque, for God's sake, So you have a time which is bursting with creative energy against the backdrop of a fading empire. And it's here that Qarar Ali, the craftsman, finds love, finds spirituality, understands what it is to be someone from Delhi. And what did that mean at that time? It meant someone who could carry multicultural identities within him, multifaceted identities. His best friend was a Hindu merchant, Hari Das, a merchant from Rajasthan. He spoke Hindi, he spoke Farsi, he spoke Urdu. Urdu itself was coming up, and Urdu was symbolic in those days of becoming, a language which carried Arabic, Hindi, Sanskrit words, Persian words. So it was a really unique time. And Qarar Ali, the protagonist, absorbs all of that and becomes this resplendent ambassador of this fantastically cross-pollinated North India / Delhi, if you wish. The
syncretism of the Ganga Jamna Tehzeeb is what Qarar Ali seems to, in many ways, embody.
That's right, and the woman that he loves him precisely for this. She hasn't fallen in love with, although she's been introduced to the one-dimensional merchant of, the finance minister of the Mughal court, and she finds him utterly one-dimensional. And here she falls in love with the craftsman. So, there is a beauty to a sponge-like and a cross-pollinated mind, which allows love to flourish. Probably in different ways.
Well, at the same time, it's interesting. I mean, this Qarar Ali is a craftsman, but he's also, for example, counterposed against the evidence of the decline of education and scientific temper in many parts he goes to. So, for example, he starts reintroducing the value of these things, right? So in Samarkand, he takes geometry lessons for children at the local madrasa, which obviously means that they weren't being offered until he got there. So that's already a sign that even in a place as resplendent as Samarkand is by repute, here he goes there at the madrasa, he discovers the children haven't got a basic geometry.
Sorry to interject, and also there's a sense of, I wouldn't say nostalgia, but a sense of lamenting that Karar Ali feels. And he looks at the East as the East. He doesn't see, because he's able to carry multicultural and varied identities, multifaceted identities. He looks at the East, that is Persia, India, all of these regions as he looks at it from the lens of an Easterner. And he laments the loss of the surge to know and explore in the Easterners, while the West has risen. And you have, the discovery of America that took place, although in the 15th century, 200 years before his life. But, America is obviously surging ahead, and he questions these new developments. And in many ways, he, one probably sees a time when we Easterners are so confined to, our little shrinking realms that we've taken our eye, off the ball, and you have this surge of inventions coming out. Isaac Newton supposedly discovering gravity when Indian and Persian mathematicians had researched this centuries and centuries ago. And so
you do have a character talking about Newton and saying that, we hear that in Europe, they're doing all this stuff. So there's while I think they have no illusions about the fact that they were way ahead of Europe in so many ways, nonetheless, I think there is a certain recognition that Europe is now overtaking old world, right? So there is that, and
that's right.
You've got this guy talking.
Yeah,
sorry.
I think Dr. Tharoor probably at that time, once again, I'd much rather call all of us Easterners. I think we Easterners were we were still thinking about the glorious past, looking at our temples and our mosques and, admiring their glory, not realizing that there was a guy called Leonardo da Vinci who had shot ahead and made new discoveries in science and anatomy and painting and all of that. And they had their renaissance. And we still, believe that we were the best, but not quite getting out there and, making a mark, if you wish.
So you have a character, in fact, saying, we, the Ottomans, Persians, and Indians, are so caught up in our inner struggles that we have lost the hunger for further oceanic and scientific discoveries. Britannia, France, Spain have their conflicts, but they are the ones now with the desire to explore. That's interesting. I think, in fact, it's either Faiz Ali or Karar who says this. And I'm struck by that because, on the one hand, this is a novel about an inner journey, about an inner quest, which is also an outward quest. But at the same time, there's a recognition that, asman aur bhi hai, that you really do have to go out and discover and so on. And so I was very struck with that. And I love the reference to Leonardo da Vinci as the Omar Khayyam of the West, a scientific genius and a painter too. I think it is important for us to recognize that there is a way of looking at the world that isn't purely Western-centered. And that's another wonderful contribution on your part. There is one more theme, slightly sensitive, that I do want to get into. I noticed we've crossed the half-an-hour mark, so I do want to bring this conversation to a close. But one specific theme we haven't alluded to is the contrast between the established formal Muslim clergy in the book, whom the Sufis see as basically mere administrators of law, and the Sufi way. I mean, the Sufi way of mysticism, of syncretism, of all of these things you and I have been talking about for the last half an hour. And it's very interesting that theme is one in which I obviously think you take sides. I mean, I think the reader comes out clearly much more sympathetic to the Sufi point of view. But is there a message you are trying to send to your readers of today who are seeing an Islam interpreted in many parts of the world and by very strong and dominant voices in a much more, some would say narrow-minded, some would say rigorous way, that is not the Sufi way?
Indeed, I am, Dr. Tharoor, and thank you for asking me this question. In many ways, the Islam that we see that is prevalent in places like Afghanistan, or for that matter, in even in current day Iran, was not the way of the Sufis. The Sufis were the cornerstones of these fantastic empires, and the reason why these empires not just survived but thrived, I'm talking about the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, is because the Sufis were the predominant advisors, and they believed in cross-cultural fertilization, and they merged with the tapestry of the society and added more layers and dimensions to it. The Sufis have always been at loggerheads with the one-dimensional clerics. They have always considered them bland, without a vision. And while the Sufis were deeply and devout Muslims, for example, Rumi, his actual title is Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, which means he was a Maulana, he was a practicing Muslim, but deeply creative. The truth was that he was a creative writer, a creative poet, a creative thinker. And that jarred, and that went completely against the grain of the administrators who were the clergy. And what I try to say in the book is the Sufi way in many ways is lost because it hasn't resonated for nearly 200 or 300 or 400 years in its true form. And I urge not just Muslims, Dr. Tharoor, but I urge mankind to take a leaf from the Sufi book, understand it, and understand that, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, the Sufi way was the heartbeat of Islam, not the one that we see in Afghanistan today.
That's beautiful. I mean, I remember a line from the book, I made a note of it, where it says the Sufis applied an esoteric, mystical, and inward meaning to the verses of the Quran, which related to renunciation, satisfaction, hope, and poverty. For them, it wasn't a rule book to be imposed on others. It was about undertaking a journey within oneself. Only when the individual self and ego is lost, the doors to illumination of the heart are opened and the universal self is found. Beautifully written, very profound. I want to invite all readers. I would hold up the book if I had it, but I don't. I only have I only have PDF, The Lost Fragrance of Infinity by Moin Mir. It's an absolutely beautiful book which illuminates the heart, and I believe will illuminate the heart of most readers. Thank you for writing it, Moin. Keep up the good work. This one is going to be a hard one to beat, hard one to top, but I look forward to your next book when you get around to it.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. And I just want to say a big, big thank you for you to take the time out and have a conversation with me. And I wish you well. And I do hope that, we will see you, inshallah, in either in India or in London.
Great. Thank you so much. And look forward to both. Look forward to welcoming you here. Look forward to being there. And of course, look forward to the post-COVID world making both journeys possible. A practical journey, not a spiritual one. Yeah. Take good care, Moin. Good luck. All the best.
Thank you.